The icy wind howled across the barren landscape, cutting through everything it touched. Snowflakes whirled through the air like frozen spears, stinging the skin of anyone foolish enough to step outside. The sky was a dull gray expanse, hanging heavy with clouds that seemed to stretch endlessly over the frozen ice planet. It was a world where life was barely possible, where survival was a constant struggle, and where only the most resilient creatures could endure. And yet here stood a group of humans, completely out of their element, shivering against the icy blasts. They were surrounded by towering figures, not of their own kind, but of alien species, beings from distant stars with advanced technology and knowledge. It was their professor, an alien named Dr. Zilok, who had brought them to this unforgiving place. Dr. Zilok was renowned across the galaxy for his intellect and unwavering belief that humanity was far too fragile to survive in the harshest environments of space. Today, however, he was about to put that belief to the test. Dr. Zilok's towering form, draped in shimmering metallic robes, loomed over the humans as he stood with his arms folded. His 6 eyes glowed with an otherworldly light, reflecting the snowy landscape around him. The aliens who stood alongside him, his students, watched with a mix of curiosity and skepticism, waiting to see what the humans would do. Today, we will witness something extraordinary. Dr. Zilok's voice boomed, reverberating in the cold air. Humans claim to be resilient, to be able to survive the harshest of conditions. But I am here to prove otherwise. This planet, this ice world, is one that will break even the strongest of beings. The students shifted uneasily, their large, multifaceted eyes fixed on the group of humans huddled together, barely able to stand against the fierce wind. It was as if the planet itself had a grudge against them, testing their every move. The humans, wrapped in heavy layers of cold-resistant gear, shivered but stood tall. They had been prepared for a challenge, though they had no idea what it would entail. Dr. Zilok smiled, the faintest trace of amusement in his voice. "The challenge I set for you is simple," he said. "You must build a shelter strong enough to survive the conditions of this planet. A shelter that will protect you from the biting cold and the relentless storms. A shelter that will withstand the power of this world." He paused for dramatic effect, watching as the humans exchanged confused glances. "In 10 minutes, he continued, you must construct an igloo, a simple shelter made entirely from the snow and ice around you. I do not believe you are capable of such a feat. In fact, I would be willing to bet that none of you will make it." The wind howled louder, as if it was speaking in agreement. The students looked at each other, their expressions full of doubt and superiority. The humans, however, remained silent. The challenge had been laid out, and there was no turning back now. One human, a volunteer named Mark, stepped forward. He was tall, with short, dark hair, and his face was determined. He wasn't a scientist or an engineer. He was just an ordinary person, someone who had spent his life working in the fields and learning the basics of survival. He knew nothing of alien technology or advanced science, but survival, real survival, was something he understood. Mark had lived in harsh conditions before. He had spent countless winters on Earth, in small towns where the snow piled high and the cold could freeze a person to death in mere minutes. He knew how to build shelters, start fires, and survive off the land. And now, standing on an ice planet where survival seemed impossible, he was going to prove to these aliens that humans could endure far more than they gave them credit for. Dr. Zilok's eyes narrowed as Mark stepped forward. "Do you understand the magnitude of what I'm asking?" he asked, his voice heavy with disbelief. "This is not a simple task. This planet is merciless. It will kill you if you make even the smallest mistake. And yet you will attempt to build an igloo, a primitive shelter, out of ice and snow. It is laughable." Mark didn't flinch. He looked up at the towering alien professor, his face set in quiet determination. "I understand," he said simply. A murmur rippled through the alien students as they exchanged skeptical glances. Mark wasn't some skilled engineer or expert in advanced technology. He was just a regular human, and it seemed impossible that he could survive such a challenge, let alone complete it in such a short amount of time. But Mark wasn't concerned with what they thought. He had his eyes set on the igloo, on the shelter that would prove them all wrong. "Time starts now," Dr. Zolak declared, his voice sharp. "You have 10 minutes. Begin." With a deep breath, Mark moved quickly toward a nearby patch of snow, his boots crunching in the frozen ground. He knelt down and began gathering the snow, packing it tightly in his hands. His movements were quick and precise, honed by years of practice in difficult conditions. He didn't need to think about it. He just knew what to do. The first block of snow was shaped and placed down, followed by another. Behind him, the alien professor and his students watched in silence. Dr. Zolak couldn't believe what he was seeing. The human was working quickly, confidently, as though he had done this before. His movements were purposeful, and though the snow was thick and the wind relentless, Mark continued to build the igloo, block by block. The timer began to tick down, and the tension in the air became almost palpable. The aliens stared at Mark, their faces etched with disbelief. They had seen many species struggle in extreme environments, but never had they seen a human attempt something so audacious. And yet here he was, building an igloo in the middle of a frozen wasteland, with nothing but his hands and his survival instincts. Dr. Zolak's voice cut through the silence. "You've made the first few blocks, but you will never finish in time. It is impossible. I've seen the strongest beings fail here. And you." He pointed to Mark. "You will fail as well." Mark didn't answer. He simply continued working, shaping the snow, stacking the blocks with care, and using his hands to smooth the edges. Every motion seemed more fluid than the last, and the igloo was slowly taking form. Mark wasn't just building a shelter. He was building something more. A statement. He wasn't going to let Dr. Zolak's doubt define him. As the wind howled, and the storm grew fiercer, the alien professor's mocking smile began to fade. He crossed his arms and watched, still skeptical, but now with a hint of curiosity in his eyes. He had seen many things in his life, but he had never seen anything like this, a human under these impossible conditions, building an igloo with nothing more than sheer willpower and resourcefulness. The clock was ticking down, each second feeling like an eternity. Dr. Zolak stood with his arms folded, watching the igloo take shape, though he still couldn't bring himself to believe it could actually be completed in time. He had seen species with advanced technology fail to survive here. How could this fragile human do what they couldn't? Mark didn't waste time thinking about what others believed. He focused solely on the task at hand. The igloo's structure was nearly complete, the entrance carved out, the dome rising steadily above the ground. The snow was solid and compact, providing shelter against the biting cold that whipped through the air. Mark knew it wouldn't be perfect, but it would be enough. As the final seconds ticked away, Mark placed the last block in place. He stepped back and surveyed his work. The igloo stood tall, sturdy, and surprisingly well constructed, given the harsh conditions. It wasn't a masterpiece, but it didn't need to be. It was a triumph of human ingenuity and willpower. "Time's up," Dr. Zolak announced, his voice betraying a hint of disbelief. The human stood before the igloo, breathing heavily from the effort. His clothes were covered in snow, his face red from the cold, but there was a quiet sense of pride in his eyes. Dr. Zolak walked forward slowly, his 6 eyes scanning the structure. His expression was unreadable, and the silence stretched on. The wind howled around them, but for a brief moment, it felt as if the world had stopped. Finally, Dr. Zolak spoke, his voice softer than before. It is finished." The aliens stood in stunned silence, their eyes wide in astonishment. Dr. Zolak, the professor who had doubted everything, stood there, unable to fully comprehend what had just happened. The human had done the impossible. And in that moment, the wind seemed to calm, as if the planet itself was acknowledging the unexpected victory. Mark turned to the alien professor, his face weary but resolute. "I told you," he said simply. "Humans don't give up." The freezing wind howled across the barren ice planet, a fierce storm battering everything in its path. Snow swirled in every direction, as if the very atmosphere had conspired to make the humans' task impossible. Mark could barely hear anything over the deafening gusts of wind, but he felt the cold bite at his skin, numbing his fingers and toes. It was like the planet itself was trying to stop him, pushing against him at every turn. But he couldn't stop. Not now. Not after everything. The alien professor, Dr. Zulok, stood tall in the distance, arms crossed, and 6 glowing eyes fixed on Mark as he continued his work. Mark could feel the alien's gaze piercing through him, the disbelieving stares of the alien students just as intense. They were all waiting for him to fail, for him to prove their expectations right, that no human could survive on an ice planet, let alone build a shelter out of the very snow and ice around them. But Mark wasn't ready to give up. He wasn't ready to let their doubt win. He had only 10 minutes. The timer was counting down, the seconds slipping away faster than he could keep track of. His hands were already frozen, the thick gloves of his survival suit offering little protection from the intense cold. He had to move quickly, but the storm was relentless, making it harder and harder to see. The snow was deep, thick, and unyielding, like the planet itself was challenging him at every turn. Mark knelt in the snow, his knees sinking into the freezing ground as he tried to gather the first blocks of ice for the igloo. The wind whipped around him, making his task even more difficult. He struggled to pick up the snow, his hands numb and stiff from the cold, but he had no choice. He couldn't stop now. He had to keep going. The first block of snow he managed to carve out was shaky and uneven, and Mark could feel the weight of Dr. Zulok's skepticism bearing down on him. The alien professor didn't believe it was possible. Mark could hear his voice in the back of his mind, taunting him, reminding him of every reason why this challenge was doomed to fail. "You're too fragile," Dr. Zulok had said earlier. "This planet will break you." The wind howled again, and Mark struggled to stay on his feet. His breath came out in ragged gasps, the icy air stinging his lungs with every inhale. He had to focus. He couldn't let his doubt or exhaustion take over. He had to keep moving. He dug his hands into the snow, pulling another block from the ice. This time, he was more careful. He needed precision. The igloo had to be sturdy enough to protect him from the freezing cold and the storm, and every block had to fit perfectly. The last thing he wanted was for the igloo to collapse before he was finished, but the snow was heavy, thick, and inconsistent. Every block he tried to carve out seemed to break, crumble, or shift out of place. It was like the planet itself was resisting his efforts, mocking him for even trying. Mark took a deep breath and steadied himself. He couldn't think about the challenges, about the odds stacked against him. All he could focus on was the next block, and then the next, and the next. The alien professor and his students watched in silence from the distance. Mark could feel their eyes on him, their gaze cold and calculating. They were waiting for him to fail. They didn't think it was possible. And as the wind tore through the icy wasteland, Mark began to doubt himself, just for a moment. Was this really possible? Could he do this? The timer was ticking down faster than he expected, and the igloo was still far from complete. The walls were uneven, the entrance barely starting to take shape. Mark had barely managed to make any progress, and the cold was making it harder to concentrate. His fingers were numb, his body shaking with the cold, and the storm showed no sign of letting up. If anything, it seemed to be growing worse, as if the planet itself was angry, as if it was trying to stop him. His mind raced. There was no way he could finish this. He could barely feel his fingers, let alone move with the precision required to finish the igloo in time. Maybe Dr. Zulok had been right. Maybe humans weren't cut out for this kind of survival. Maybe they didn't belong on this planet at all. Just then, a gust of wind knocked him off balance. He fell to the ground, the snow biting at his face as he struggled to get back up. He had lost his footing and had to dig his hands into the ice to regain control. His heart raced as he scrambled to his feet, his breath coming in ragged gasps. The clock was ticking down, and the igloo still wasn't finished. He could hear the murmurs of the aliens behind him, their voices rising in disbelief. "He's failing," one of them whispered. "There's no way he can finish." Mark didn't care about their whispers. He didn't care what they thought. He had to finish this. For himself. For the humans watching. For everyone who had ever been told they weren't strong enough, capable enough, or smart enough to survive. This igloo was more than just a shelter. It was a testament to human resilience. It was a challenge he had to overcome. He wiped the snow from his face and pushed through the pain. His hands were shaking from the cold, but he ignored it. He had to keep going. He had to build. With a renewed sense of determination, Mark picked up another block of snow. This time, it didn't break or crumble. He fitted into place, one block at a time, until he could feel the walls beginning to take shape. His hands were numb, but he didn't stop. The storm was relentless, the cold cutting into his bones, but he focused on the task. He could do this. As he built the igloo, Mark remembered all the winters he had spent on Earth, battling against the cold, trying to survive in the harshest conditions. He remembered the survival lessons his father had taught him, how to build shelters, how to stay warm, how to adapt to the elements. He remembered all the times he had felt like giving up, but pushed through anyway. He had learned that survival wasn't about being the strongest or the smartest. It was about persistence. It was about never giving up, no matter how tough things got. And that's what he did. He persisted. With only minutes left on the clock, Mark finally had the walls of the igloo standing. The entrance was still small, but he knew he could finish it in time. He dug through the snow, using every last ounce of strength to finish the task. His body ached from the cold and exhaustion, but he didn't stop. He wouldn't stop. As the clock ticked down, Mark placed the last block into place. He stood back, surveying his work. The igloo wasn't perfect. It wasn't as polished as some of the shelters the aliens might build with their advanced technology. But it was standing. It was sturdy. And most importantly, it was a shelter. It would protect him from the storm. The timer buzzed. Mark took a deep breath, his heart pounding in his chest. He had done it. He had built an igloo. Against all odds, he had completed the challenge. Behind him, the alien professor stood in stunned silence. The students, once skeptical, looked on in disbelief. The storm raged around them, but Mark's igloo stood firm, a testament to human strength and perseverance. The wind howled louder than ever, as if the planet itself was screaming in defiance. Mark could feel the cold seeping into his bones. His body ached from the relentless exposure to the elements. His hands were numb, his breath ragged, but the igloo, his igloo, was finally taking shape. He had come so far. The storm that had once seemed so threatening was now nothing more than a distant background to the battle he was fighting within himself. The last few minutes had become a battle against time, exhaustion, and doubt. The timer continued ticking down, and Mark couldn't afford to look at it. He knew it was getting close. The alien professor, Dr. Zilok, and his students stood on the other side, watching in silence. For a while, Mark hadn't been able to hear the murmurs of disbelief or the mocking comments from the aliens. It was as though the noise from the storm had drowned them out. All that mattered was the igloo, the shelter he had promised himself he would finish. It was strange. As he worked, he realized something he hadn't truly grasped before. It wasn't just about surviving the cold or proving the professor wrong. It was about something deeper, a personal victory. For years, humans had been seen as fragile, out of place in the vast universe. They were constantly underestimating their own potential. And now, standing on this cold, frozen planet, Mark had one goal in mind: to prove that human ingenuity and resilience could stand up to the harshest challenges. But doubt had started to creep in. With each block of snow he placed, with each gust of wind that tried to knock him down, Mark questioned whether he was truly going to make it. The storm had intensified, and the snow was no longer cooperating. The winds had turned into a relentless blizzard, tearing at the walls of the igloo. His legs shook from the cold, and his mind started to play tricks on him. The igloo was close, so close to being finished, but the cold was beginning to cloud his thoughts. The sense of urgency was taking over, and the self-doubt, the lingering worry, crept in again. Was this really enough? Was it strong enough to hold up against the storm? He looked around at the distant figures of Dr. Zuluk and the students. Their faces were still frozen in disbelief, their eyes locked on his every move. The alien professor had clearly expected him to fail. There had been no real confidence in his challenge. He had made it clear that he thought humans would never survive in this extreme environment, that they lacked the resilience required to live in a place like this. The storm howled again, snapping Mark from his thoughts. It was like the planet was laughing at him, mocking his attempts, laughing at his tiny igloo. For a second, he hesitated. Then something shifted. He thought back to his father, to the old survival lessons they had taught him. The hours spent building shelters in harsh winters on Earth, the countless times he had failed, only to rise again, better and stronger. The memories flooded his mind. The sound of his father's voice, calm and reassuring, telling him that the difference between survival and failure was the will to keep going, to push forward even when it seemed impossible, to not give up when everything was against you. Mark clenched his fists, and the realization hit him. He wasn't just building an igloo. He was building something much bigger, a declaration. He was showing Dr. Zuluk and the rest of the galaxy that humans weren't just fragile beings. They were capable of resilience, of overcoming even the most daunting challenges. The wind roared in his ears, but Mark's focus sharpened. He turned back to the igloo, his body a mixture of exhaustion and determination. He had to finish this. He couldn't let the storm, or his doubts, stop him now. The final few blocks were the hardest. The storm had torn at the igloo, weakening its structure. Mark could feel the ice shifting, the snow slipping from his grasp, but he didn't back down. He didn't even stop to catch his breath. Every second counted, and the clock was ticking faster than ever. The igloo wasn't perfect. The walls were uneven, the snow hadn't settled completely, and the cold was eating away at the structure. But it was a shelter. It would protect him, and it was going to be enough. He placed the final block of snow into position. The igloo was completed. Mark stood up, his legs shaky, his body aching from the cold. His breath came in shallow bursts as he stepped back to admire his work. He had done it. He had actually done it. The igloo stood firm against the onslaught of the storm, and despite the wind howling around it, the shelter seemed to hold its own. He turned to Dr. Zuluk. The alien professor was still standing there, his expression unreadable, his 6 eyes fixed on the human-made igloo. For the first time, Mark saw a flicker of something other than disdain in the professor's gaze. There was a hint of uncertainty there, as if Dr. Zuluk wasn't sure what to make of what he was seeing. Mark walked slowly toward the igloo's entrance, his hands shaking from both the cold and the adrenaline pumping through his veins. The storm continued to rage outside, the wind howling louder, but inside the igloo there was warmth, a warmth that had nothing to do with the temperature and everything to do with the victory he had just earned. He turned back to Dr. Zuluk, his eyes steady. It's finished. For a moment, there was nothing but silence. The students behind Dr. Zuluk were still, their mouths slightly agape, their disbelief hanging in the air like a thick fog. No one said anything. The storm raged on, but Mark could hear his heartbeat pounding in his chest. He knew the moment of truth had arrived. He had done the impossible. He had proven them all wrong. Dr. Zuluk, ever the academic, took a step forward, his eyes narrowing as he took in the completed igloo. His lips twitched into a tight smile, one that could almost be mistaken for respect. Well, The alien professor said, his voice unexpectedly soft. "It seems I was mistaken." Mark's heart raced in his chest. The words that had once felt impossible for an alien professor to speak, were now out in the open. The students exchanged looks, their skepticism slowly melting away. They had watched him struggle, watched him fight against the elements, and now they were seeing something incredible unfold. They were seeing what humans were capable of. Dr. Zilok continued, his tone more thoughtful now. Humans have always been seen as weak, incapable of surviving in environments like this. But you. He paused for a moment, his 6 eyes scanning Mark carefully. You have proven me wrong. You've shown me that humans possess something far more important than strength or advanced technology. You possess resilience. The word hung in the air, and Mark felt a weight lift from his shoulders. Resilience. That was what he had been fighting for all along. Dr. Zilok's tone became more serious, and there was an edge of respect in his voice that hadn't been there before. Perhaps I underestimated you. Mark nodded, his voice steady. Maybe you did, but we'll always find a way to survive. The storm raged outside, but inside the igloo, Mark stood victorious. The turning point had come. Against all odds, against the harshest conditions and the disbelief of the most advanced alien species, he had succeeded. He had built more than an igloo. He had built a bridge, one that connected humans to the very essence of survival in a galaxy full of doubt. The world outside was still cold and unforgiving, but in that small shelter of ice and snow, Mark had proven something far more powerful, that humans could survive, no, thrive, against the impossible. The storm was unforgiving, its wind howling like a beast, determined to tear everything apart. Snow whirled through the air, biting at the skin, the chill of the ice planet seeping into every crack and crevice of the surroundings. Mark stood inside the igloo, its walls of snow and ice offering a fragile shield against the brutal environment outside. His breath came in shallow gasps, the exhaustion of the past few minutes weighing heavily on his chest. His hand shook as he wiped the snow from his face, his body trembling with both the cold and the adrenaline that had coursed through him. For a moment, everything seemed to freeze in time. The storm raged outside, but inside the igloo, there was warmth, warmer than the icy winds could ever touch. The storm had lost its power inside these walls, and for the first time, Mark felt a sense of peace wash over him. It wasn't about the igloo anymore. It wasn't just about proving the alien professor wrong. It was about survival. It was about showing the galaxy, showing the alien species that humans, though small and often underestimated, could thrive against the odds. Mark stepped out of the igloo, his feet crunching against the snow, and approached Dr. Zilok. The alien professor's eyes, once filled with mocking disbelief, were now somber. There was no longer any sign of the smugness that had marked his earlier words. Instead, Dr. Zilok's expression was one of reluctant respect. His 6 eyes, glowing faintly in the harsh light of the storm, were fixed on Mark. The alien students who had once stood behind him, laughing and whispering amongst themselves, now stood in stunned silence. Their gazes were fixed on the human who had completed what they had all believed impossible. Mark could feel their eyes on him, some full of awe, others of disbelief. There was no question now. The challenge had been won. Dr. Zilok spoke first, his voice heavy, almost thoughtful. "It seems that you've done it." His words were measured, but there was no mistaking the change in his tone. It was the voice of someone who had just witnessed something extraordinary, something that defied all the expectations they had clung to. Mark stood tall, his face flushed from the cold, but there was a quiet pride in his eyes. "I told you," he said, his voice steady and firm. "Humans can adapt. We can survive when it seems impossible." Dr. Zilok nodded slowly, acknowledging the truth in Mark's words. "Yes," he murmured, more to himself than to anyone else. "I believe that the extremes of this planet would break you, but you've shown me that I was wrong." He paused, his gaze lingering on the human-made igloo. This is more than just a shelter. It is a testament to your resilience, a testament to the strength of the human spirit. The storm outside roared louder than ever, as if in agreement, but the igloo stood firm, solid, and unyielding against the planet's cruel assault. The wind may have been howling, but within the confines of that shelter, Mark knew he had proven something far greater than simply surviving the ice planet. He had proven the value of human resilience, determination, and ingenuity. Dr. Zillock took a few steps forward, his voice now softer, tinged with something like admiration. I have seen many species in my travels. I have studied countless civilizations, but never have I witnessed such a display of perseverance from a species so fragile. He paused again, his words measured. Perhaps there is more to humanity than I believed. Mark stood in silence, taking in the professor's words. He had heard many insults from the alien professor, heard him dismiss humanity as weak and unworthy. But now those words had lost their power. The victory wasn't just in the completion of the igloo. It was in the quiet, unspoken respect that had replaced the professor's doubt. Mark had earned that respect. The alien students, who had once regarded the human with the same skepticism as their professor, now looked at Mark with something different: respect, admiration, and perhaps even a bit of awe. Their expressions were no longer filled with mockery. They had witnessed something incredible. One student, an alien with glowing green skin and multiple arms, took a cautious step forward. His eyes, usually cold and judgmental, now held a new light. We could not believe, he admitted, his voice soft. We thought it was impossible. But now, seeing it with our own eyes, we understand. Mark nodded, his eyes scanning the group. I didn't do it alone. The human spirit isn't about individuals, it's about community. About doing what it takes to survive, no matter the odds. The alien professor and his students stood in silence for a long moment, taking in Mark's words. The wind continued to batter the station, but inside that small igloo, there was warmth. There was unity. And there was something that had been earned through sweat, struggle, and resilience. Mark had earned his place among them, and he had earned their respect. Dr. Zillock finally broke the silence. You've changed my perspective, he said, his voice quiet but filled with something Mark hadn't expected. I have always believed that survival was a matter of strength, of technology. But now I see that it is more about something deeper, something intangible. Mark smiled, a small, knowing smile. It's about heart, he said simply. As the storm outside continued to rage, the group gathered inside the igloo, sheltered from the bitter cold. The warmth inside the igloo wasn't just from the protection it offered against the storm. It was the warmth of a shared victory, of a moment that transcended doubt and disbelief. Mark had done more than build an igloo. He had built a bridge between species, showing the aliens that there was more to humanity than they had ever known. As the minutes passed and the storm showed no sign of letting up, Dr. Zillock turned to Mark once more. You have proven yourself today, he said, his voice filled with a new respect. You have shown us that even in the most extreme conditions, humans can find a way to survive. Perhaps it is time that I reconsider my view of your species. Mark felt a surge of pride in his chest. The challenge had not been easy. There had been moments of doubt, moments where he thought he might not make it. But now, standing in that igloo with Dr. Zillock and the other aliens, he felt something he had never felt before, a true sense of triumph. The storm outside couldn't touch him anymore. He had done the impossible. Dr. Zillock's expression softened, and for the first time, there was no hint of mockery or skepticism. Instead, there was a glimmer of admiration. Perhaps, he said slowly, we can learn from each other. Perhaps it is time to see the potential in your species, rather than focusing on your weaknesses. Mark nodded, feeling the weight of the professor's words settle in his chest. Maybe we can teach each other. There's always more to learn after all. With that, the aliens began to gather, murmuring among themselves, their voices quieter now, filled with awe and reflection. The storm outside may have raged on, that the humans and aliens in that small, human-made igloo knew that something had shifted. Mark had shown them that survival wasn't just about technology or power. It was about the will to survive, the determination to push through the impossible. Mark turned one last time to Dr. Zalak. The alien professor met his gaze, his 6 eyes filled with something new. "You have earned our respect," he said, his voice no longer cold and dismissive, but filled with genuine acknowledgement. Mark smiled, the exhaustion finally catching up to him, but the triumph in his heart keeping him upright. "That's all I ever wanted," he said softly. Outside, the storm raged on, but inside the igloo, there was no fear, no doubt. There was only the warmth of triumph and the unspoken bond of mutual respect. And in that moment, Mark knew that humanity had proven itself, not through strength, not through advanced technology, but through something far more powerful, resilience. And in the depths of the ice planet, amidst the howling winds and the raging storm, humanity had claimed its place in the universe.